Welcome back to ReadingBear. Today, we will take a look at some new malicious compliance stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, I Have to Find My Own Coverage? Alrighty then. About 10 years ago I got my first job at a nursing home after coming off of active duty military. The director of nursing, who we'll call Dawn, was in the reserves, so we hit it off pretty quick. I got my nursing license while in the military, and I had only really cared for young strapping soldiers, not the elderly, but Dawn and other nurses taught me the ropes. It was a good place to work. I was able to pick up shifts whenever I needed them. I made some really good friends, and the residents and their family were all pretty great, with the occasional not so great ones. Now when I went off active duty I enlisted in the reserves. I wasn't quite ready to be fully done with my military career. Drill was always the first weekend of the month. Always. I still made sure the scheduler had a copy of my drill schedule. After a year, Dawn deploys. Enter the interim director of nursing, who we'll call Satan. I mean Karen. She had an issue with me since day one. Not sure why. I never missed work, took care of my patients like they were family. I had never been in trouble. I just was nowhere near her list of favorites. Within the first 2 months of Karen being there, the scheduler quit. I made sure new scheduler had a copy of my drill schedule. New scheduler was cool. Was able to change us from 8 hours shifts to 12s, made sure the same nurses worked the same halls for continuity of care. Never had an issue with her. After 3 months that scheduler quit along with a few staff. A young girl from the front office covered staffing for a few weeks until they were able to fill the position. A nurse transferred from the floor to scheduling. She was a bit scatterbrained, but was good at her job and was not afraid to work the floor when needed. Once again I made sure she knew when I had drill. She lasted about 4 months. The girl from the office once again stepped in and eventually got the position full-time. I pointed out my drill schedule to her. It was hanging on a bulletin board where the previous girl put it, and she said she understood. By this point my patience with Karen was running thin. She found ways to make sure I knew she didn't like me with almost every shift. Checking to make sure my med cart was locked 5 to 6 times a day. She never checked other med carts, go into rooms and push the call light to see how long I took to answer, once again only on my hall, and always had snarky comments to make about what she decided I was doing wrong that day. Now I worked that hall 3 to 4 days a week, 12 plus hours a day. I had that hall down to a science, and I had the best CNAS, certified nursing assistants, in the building. They were rock stars. Karen decided that I could handle it and pulled my CNAS during breakfast for dining room duty. I had to do morning med pass, check blood sugars, do insulin on the diabetic residents, toilet them if needed, pass breakfast trays, and feed a few people on my own. I had 34 residents on my hall and only about 12 of them went to the dining room. I was not happy to say the least, but I found a routine and was able to knock it out. That made Karen try harder to get to me. Then on a beautiful snowy Thursday at the very end of January, the schedule for the rest of the weekend, and following week came out. The coming weekend was the first weekend of the month. And what do I always have on the first weekend of the month? Yup, drill. I was still on the schedule for that weekend. Scheduler was nowhere to be found and not answering her phone. I text the nurse who works my hall on days I'm off to see if she could pick up and I would work for her next weekend. No dice, she was going out of town and couldn't. The scheduler finally texts me and tells me that I never told her that drill was this weekend and had no one to cover my shifts. I told her that I'm willing to trade the weekend with anyone and work their shift. She texts back that she has no one and that I should have told her about my drill weekend ahead of time. So I went to her office once she got back from wherever she was and as nicely as possible point to the drill schedule hanging on the wall right next to her desk and ask how she couldn't know when it was hanging right next to her. The blood drained from her face and she said she will figure it out. I remind her to tell the other nurses that I will pick up shifts in return if it helps cover it. An hour later good old Karen comes up to me and lays into me. She tells me I'm irresponsible for not telling the scheduler my drill schedule and that they are not finding coverage for my shifts. I either have to work them or find coverage myself. She asked how she could even sure I really had drill weekends and wasn't just trying to get out of work, that she should write me up. She would cut me off anytime I would open my mouth to speak. Once she said her fill, Karen took off to her office. I'm a pretty laid-back person and I'm usually very calm. My blood was boiling. I was able to get my shifts covered pretty easily since we were pretty well staffed. The scheduler hadn't even tried apparently. Well, she tried throwing me under the bus. Drill weekend comes and goes. Monday morning I bring copies of my DD 214 from active duty, my orders sending me to my reserve unit, about 10 copies of my drill schedule, and printed pic of the drill schedule hanging on the wall next to the scheduler desk. I had already found coverage for the drill weekends I had to work for the next 6 months and even started on finding coverage for the 2-week drill a few months away. After morning med pass, tray pass, feeding, and toileting were finished, I walked into Karen's office, handed her the DD 124 and the orders. Told her that there is her proof of my military duty. Handed her the pic of the schedule hanging on the wall, told her I should not have to remind them every month, especially when it's hanging next to the scheduler's desk. Handed her the 10 drill copies just in case they needed more since the one didn't seem to be enough. She just sat there glaring without saying a word until I put the list of weekends I had already found coverage for in front of her. Then she smirked and said maybe this taught me how to be more responsible. I smiled and told her oh absolutely it did, since my time in the service obviously didn't teach me anything and that I'm sure my soldiers would appreciate her teaching their platoon sergeant such an important lesson. Then I slammed my 2 weeks' notice on her desk and explained to her that what she tried to pull was illegal and that I could have the Department of Justice in there so fast her head would spin. As I walked out of her office, State walked into the building. State audits nursing facilities. They watch everything and go through everything and make life hell for mainly management for a week or two. One of the state auditors ended up being ex-Army. She hung out on my hall just chatting every day I worked. Karen would look at me like a deer in headlights when she walked down my hall. I guess she thought I would purposely get them dinged or something. I was good and just enjoyed her nervousness. I trained my replacement the next week. I went on to the local hospital and I'm still there. Karen went back to corporate once Dawn came back from Iraq. She learned what happened and reported her to corporate for that and some other things. Karen was fired. The scheduler was fired a few months after I left. Turns out her mum, who was a unit manager, was doing her job. Asterisk, if you take a shot every time I say schedule, scheduler, or drill, I think you may have alcohol poisoning by the end. The next one is titled, Challenge Anyone? Okay. This is my dad's story of the small time that he was an airman in the US Air Force, probably back in the early 1950s. He worked guard at an airbase up north with cold winters. He was positioned as a night guard that was guarding airplanes out next to the runway. Every night, with his jacket wrapped tightly around him, he got up and out to the runway. He patrolled up and down the runway down the long line of airplanes. Armed only with a flashlight and a .45 caliber handgun, he was to challenge any who he came across. Like anyone would actually want to be out in the cold weather. One night his sergeant, who did not like my dad and kept him on the patrol shift, came out to check on him. My dad saw the sergeant approaching and could tell who it was in the bright moonlight. When the sergeant rounded the airplane, Dad called, "I'm here, Sergeant." What followed was a verbal lashing from the sergeant, of course getting more and more dramatic every time my dad told the story. The sergeant basically gave orders that my father was to challenge anyone who was out at the airplanes with a sharp halt. "Who goes there, command?" The sergeant warned that if my dad did not challenge him that exact way, that the next time he would be in trouble and would have even worse detail. My dad didn't like the idea of anything worse than walking a guard duty of planes in the middle of freezing weather, so he meant to do just that. Now, walking around all night meant a lot of boredom, and all he had to keep his mind occupied was a flashlight and a .45 caliber handgun. He started entertaining himself by learning to flip the flashlight in the air and catch it, flip it into his pocket, and basically several tricks with it. Next, he started practicing a quick draw with the .45, where in a split second he could draw the .45 halfway from the holster, turn it sideways, cock the slide and get it out of the holster. Oh, to hear him tell it, he was like unto the Long Ranger with the speed he improved to after about 2 weeks of practice. It wasn't too long later that he heard that sergeant out on the runway again, coming toward my dad. Cue malicious compliance. Now my dad was not really a sneaky kind of man, but he made his way as quietly down the line of airplanes closer and closer to the sergeant. He has made up in his mind what he was going to do. As soon as he got near the sergeant, he jumped out from behind the plane, his flashlight illuminating the person, and his immediately chambered 45 flashed out into his hand with a booming halt. Who goes there? But what the flashlight illuminated was not a slightly scared sergeant, but a lieutenant who was up and out early to check out his plane for an early morning mission. Who, upon seeing the tenacity of the guard before him and the 45 trained on him, immediately answered up, "Whoa. Whoa. Lieutenant Smith. I am just checking out my bird, son. I got an early mission. Do you want to see the orders?" My dad immediately holstered the weapon and flipped his flashlight into his pocket and saluted. "Sorry sir, but my orders are to challenge anyone who is found out here next to the planes at night." The lieutenant smiled and answered back, "Shoot no son." "Fine job. What is your name, airman?" "I would like to tell your sergeant he has a hell of a guard out here." After the good word got back to the sergeant, he had a little pity on my dad and let him swap out nights on the runway with 2 other guards so he didn't have to be out there every night. The next one is titled, "I must provide detailed information about my doctor's appointment to get approved for paid time off." Are you absolutely sure? Well, if you say so. A few years ago, I worked in an office with some pretty strange and crappy rules. One such rule was that while we could apply personal PTO, paid time off, for any reason, management needed a detailed summary of the reason before they would approve. This resulted in several instances of co-workers applying for PTO for things like funerals and birthdays and being told, "The current project deadline is more important than your niece's birthday," or "Do you really need to attend your mother's cousin's funeral? That doesn't sound pressing." It was a really toxic system that resulted in some turnover from co-workers who were sick of being held hostage over PTO. Furthermore, both the department manager and the HR manager needed to sign off on the PTO request, which resulted in some frustrating situations where one approved, but the other did not. It did not help that the HR manager was a dick. Pretty much the only time you could expect to be approved was for court dates and important medical appointments. But you still needed to provide details even if it happened to be a very personal medical or legal situation. This does not strike me as legal, but, sadly, this isn't the first time I've run into this working in Texas. One more bit of context: my department manager was also a jerk. Without going into too much detail, he was a power-tripping sloth who liked to harass women, like me. Let's call him Jerk, and the HR manager Dick. We all hated both of them. On to the MC. I had an important appointment with my psychiatrist coming up. My meds for anxiety and PTSD were not cutting the mustard anymore, and I was in a bad place mentally. I needed a med adjustment, so I took the soonest appointment available. Work would have to cope with a couple of hours without me. I submitted my PTO request to Jerk and Dick for approval. Given the intensely personal nature of the appointment, I left the details sparse. It was rejected. Both Jerk and Dick said in an email that I needed to give details about my appointment in accordance with company policy. Jerk had the nerve to call me into his office and chide me over my unacceptably terse PTO request. "You know the rules, why would you waste my time with such a brief request? You know I can't approve this," etc. I was upset. But as I stewed in my cubicle, it dawned on me that I could get back at Jerk and Dick merely by complying with their own rules. I formulated a plan. I sent an email to Dick and said, "Jerk, always CYA folks." I said, "Are you sure you need the details of my appointment? Are you positive? It's really personal." Both Dick and Jerk said, "Yes, we need the details of your PTO circumstances, you know the rules." I replied that it's very private. "Are you sure I need to talk about it?" We sent some emails back and forth until I was sure I had a solid paper trail. Then I decided, if they really need my personal medical details, which I still think is illegal, but whatever, then I suppose I better give it to them. I submitted a new PTO request with all the relevant information. That I was going to see my psychiatrist for an urgent appointment. I needed to be seen at the earliest possible time because I was having thoughts of hurting myself, because I have PTSD from being raped in foster care. I threw in some details about what my foster father did to me, how I went numb and used drugs to cope, how I was hospitalized as a teenager for a suicide attempt. I also screenshotted and emailed my request to a few of the higher-ups, saying my previous request was insufficient, so I wanted to make sure I got it right this time. I submitted it. There were no snippy emails this time. Only approved appearing in green text to my request in the system maybe 4 minutes after I submitted it. I blissfully went about my day, happy to have my PTO. Curiously, neither Jerk nor Dick emerged from their offices. The fallout: when I showed up for work at 8 the following day, I was immediately called into the VP's office. One of the higher managers and a woman that I recognized from legal were also present. VP politely asked me to sit and kindly explain the grotesque email I had sent out yesterday. He was a polite but rather out-of-touch older gentleman. So I made myself clear I needed PTO for a very personal doctor's appointment, and my previous request was denied by both Jerk and Dick for being too brief, and Jerk even called me in his office to complain about my wasting his time. I didn't want to be rejected again, so I made sure my request was as detailed as possible. I also passed it on to management to verify that the level of detail was up to snuff when it came to corporate guidelines. And yes, I do have PTSD, it's all true, and they can reference my ADA paperwork in HR for more information. VP asked me a couple more brief questions. He then apologized for the hassle, said I was being credited some extra PTO for my trouble, and that the company would be reviewing its approach to the PTO approval process. I was then dismissed back to my desk. I received written apologies from Jerk and Dick that very morning, hand-delivered by a tense and rather petrified Jerk. I think legal put him up to it. Both Jerk and Dick went out of their way to avoid me for the remainder of my time at the company, which was a blessing. The few times we were forced to interact, they spoke very quickly and looked desperate to end the conversation. I guess my PTO request was a little too intense for them. Whatever the case, it was the end of Jerk's little power trips, at least with me personally. Also that same morning we received a company-wide email marked as important. There was a change in the PTO policy. Requests with regards to medical and other sensitive reasons no longer required detailed explanations, effective immediately. Bonus: one of my friends in HR, well, not really a friend, but a woman who liked to discuss crocheting with me at the water cooler, showed me an internal email from Dick to all HR staff. Every PTO request from me personally was to be approved immediately and without question. I tested this later that summer by requesting a day off to watch Netflix. That's specifically what I put in the request field. I planned on quitting soon, so I was in a flippant mood. It was approved immediately. I think they had me flagged in their system. Truth be told, I could have probably taken a whole month off and gotten paid for it, but I didn't push my luck. I left the company for a much more tolerable, less toxic, higher-paying job about 6 months later. And yes, my appointment went well and I'm doing better now. I started attending a trauma support group, met my SO, and I've even been able to reduce the dose of one of my meds. The next one is titled, "Don't Interrupt Me." Why didn't you interrupt me? We got wrong number calls at my old job pretty frequently from people trying to reach a different insurance company. Me, intro wrong number. Hi, I have a policy with competitor and I just had some questions about my last claim. You see, I'm me. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say WN? Don't interrupt me. I was trying to tell you that I filed my claim, and she rambles on for 4 minutes straight about all the issues she had with her claim. She mentioned the name of the other company again during her spiel, and the things she was saying didn't quite fit with the procedures of the company I worked for. So I was quite sure that she did not have a policy with us. But she said not to interrupt, so I didn't. WN, so I was wondering if you could look into this for me. Me, I'd be happy to help, but did you mention that your policy is with competitor? WN, yes. Me, this is name of the company she called. Sorry about that. WN, you let me say all that and didn't tell me I called the wrong place. Why didn't you interrupt me? Hangs up. The next one is titled, "I Have to Share." You sure? English class. Not so kind word teacher. First period. On a day I'm already barely holding life together and have already cried twice. For some context, I am normally a very proactive sharer. As top of my class, I believe in all working together and sharing to learn more. Furthermore, I did not have a great childhood at all. Lots of garbage stuff has happened which I really don't want to go into. I digress. Our new assignment is to make a Where I'm From poem, the original by George Ella Leon. Go ahead, look it up. As a brainstorming activity for this assignment, we were going around the room multiple times talking about happy things that we remember and want to write about in our poems. When she would get to me, I said I didn't want to share, and that was respected for 3 rounds. Unfortunately, I wasn't going to get away with this uncomfortable avoidance, and finally my teacher was insistent I shared. Despite many protests, I was told I must share. And seeing as my morning has been rough, I wasn't in the mood to make stuff up. Yeah, I could probably write about the abusive daycare for things I used to look forward to. Oh. And for phrases our parents repeated a lot, I could probably talk about all the arguing and throwing stuff and duck yous that were tossed around. And all of my memories from recess. I'm sure it would be great to talk about how I used to go cry with a coloring book behind the big oak tree on the far side of the playground in elementary school. The whole class went silent. Not a word. And that's new when I won. My teacher's response was, well, I think now's a good time for a mask break. I have since been told I could have an alternate assignment if I wanted. But I've declined. I think this might be a good therapeutic activity, and making her uncomfortable is an added bonus. The last one is titled, Please change your Facebook review to a positive one. Okay. A few years ago I bought a new shed-sunroof combination for my garden. It was pretty expensive and thus I also paid for the company to build it. Knowing me, I would mess up, so I was happy to pay for a professional to come fix that for me. The shed has a roof with a bitumen topping. It looks like very thick sandpaper. The professional builder tacked it in place and that was that. I asked him if no glue would be needed to keep it in place, but obviously I know nothing and that was a dumb question. Lo and behold, 6 weeks later a mild storm blew off the entire bitumen topping of the roof. I called the company only to be told I should have known this would be a temporary roof and these need to be changed like every year. Can you smell the BS? I replied, it has only been 6 weeks, you need to come fix this. Nope, a storm was the reason for damage, act of God, no help from them. Well okay, they promised to send a new roll of bitumen so I could replace it myself. I waited, no bitumen. I went to their Facebook page to find lots of people complaining about similar stuff. I wrote a review warning people to not buy their expensive sheds as they get built wrong and any damage resulting from this does not get resolved by them whatsoever. Mind you, this shed was over €1,000. A half an hour later I get a phone call from said company. They tell me they will come the next day to put on expensive shingles to make up for the damage, at their own cost. But I do have to change my review. I waited for them to come fix it, and they held to their promise. So did I wrote on their page how they came and fixed my roof, even exchanged the material for a much more expensive solution, the very next day, at their own cost. Needless to say, this caused a shitstorm of customers demanding the same solution. You're welcome, a-holes. Since people keep asking, yes, they came to fix the roof. Thanks for listening.